Hi everyone, I hope you're all well. I'm here today to talk to you about our topic for week 5, which is police powers and duties, and sort of a little bit about roles and functions too. So it's a bit more content than usual today, so I'm going to hopefully skip through it, probably no more than half an hour. The reason why we're talking about this is it's fairly important to define exactly what it is that police officers do. And typically the image that we get of police officers and what they actually do is, kind of summarised on this particular cartoon on the first slide where, crime is represented by the gun. The police officer is standing in front of the family, of course, represented by the police badge. Often, of course, we also get images of police like this, where they're out in the field and they're, picking up on people that are doing things wrong. And again, I love this particular cartoon simply because it makes me giggle. But they're involved in a lot of other work as well that we probably don't see so much of. So the usual roles, functions, images of police, I suppose, we get are things like attending crimes, looking into scenes, accidents, deaths, incidents, all of that sort of stuff, doing different types of law enforcement work with fines and arrest, rescuing people, particularly in accidents and natural disasters, investigation work of all sorts that I'll talk about more in a moment, targeting criminals, doing things like patrol work, which interestingly enough is about 75% of police work internationally, but it's mostly ineffective when it comes to controlling crime. It's more about the perceptions that people have police of doing their job, the symbolic affirmation of police authority over particular pieces of territory. And of course, as an intervention force overall, in situations where they might have riots and so forth, involved in different forms of regulation exercises where they might have riots, etc., and exercising and commanding authority. The images that we don't often have of what police do and their roles and their functions most certainly incorporates the whole social worker idea. And of course, we touched on this in the first week. But overall, police are about help and assistance, and they will often talk about how they join the police in order to do different forms of help and assistance. But this, of course, comes also in organising protests and events in conjunction with different groups, having and using their discretion in deciding whether or not to enforce the law. For instance, Waddington talks about one of the most dominant characteristics of policing work is to decide whether or not they enforce the law. And in fact, overall, probably the most common thing that police do is the non-enforcement of the law in so many different areas. Deciding whether or not something is a crime, regulating civil activity more broadly, and overall general civility in this notion of social happiness that we talked about earlier in the year. And generally, police are, I suppose, a repository for something that ought not to be happening and about which someone had better do something now. And that's a beautiful quote that I love from Bittner, because that can be anything from someone being murdered or someone attempting to take someone's life, right down to the point of, as we've seen earlier in this unit, helping people with their homework, getting cats out of trees that are stuck up there, all manner of different things. They are effectively in a 24-hour emergency service. The police officers don't think of themselves as being social workers, something that I've already touched on before. And this quote from a female police liaison officer in Queensland in a research project that I did kind of sums that up pretty well. The community doesn't want to meet the police every month. To say what? We're police. We're not social workers. We're not offering a solution. So this kind of butts up against with the notion that police are a social service, most definitely. So we see things like a whole range of different specialist units within police, firearms, traffic, mounted police dog squads, child protection, special victims, domestic violence, public order units, school and youth liaison units, drugs liaison, and of course different forms of partnership coordination. So this is fairly massive in terms of what police should and are involved in. So the core policing functions and roles, we've already touched on this a little bit. It's a whole broad range of tasks, including public reassurance, crime reduction, investigation as an emergency service, peacekeeping, order maintenance, and state security. But of course, defining those core functions can be a little bit problematic because, again, it comes back to that notion of whether or not it's a force or service, which is something that we talked about earlier in the semester. Waddington says that to the extent that police exercise authority over citizens, then policing is hesitant and cautious because citizens have rights. But where police impose alien authority on a rebellious subject population, then coercive power is exercised with little restraint. These types of ideas definitely raise a whole range of different issues around the ways in which police are perceived, the ways in which policing power is received, most importantly, by the public when police are doing their work. And there's a whole range of different factors which can influence police functions and the types of roles that they do, etc. I'm not going to talk through every one of these. It's outlined in the reading that I've put up for you this week. I think this is the one. I can't quite remember, but I'm pretty sure that I've covered that somewhere else. But we're looking at traditions and conventions of policing and the way that we think about policing, political expedience and whether or not they want police to process things really quickly, the police perception overall and the ways in which the public perceives the police, community expectations, media representations of police, the nature of the community being policed overall, and whether or not there is a consensus about what police should be doing. That is, whether or not the community and what they think police should be doing is matched by what the police are actually doing in the community, most importantly. Internal bureaucratic constraints can often be something that very much influences police functions, resourcing, government funding, and so forth. The organisational policies and the fact that these often differ by rank, experience, and specialisation. The discretion the police have and the structures of responsibility and the consequence of having very wide police discretion as opposed to very narrow or limited discretion. Individual and collective determinations of law, professional standards and job satisfaction, pressures from other agencies, for instance, criminal justice organisations around or policy organisations around what priorities should be within police organisations, and of course occupational solidarity. All of these things influence police functions in some way. In addition to that, police are very much impacted by what the community think about police, and these different things influence this. Their personal experience with police, for instance, which we'll talk about a lot more over coming weeks. The word of mouth that they hear about police in the community, something that very much influences what happens in Aboriginal communities and LGBTI communities, for instance. The news and the media, of course. Different forms of entertainment, TV, movies, radio, and so forth. And of course, often the fact that these forms of information can be highly dubious. And finally, of course, the visible side of police work and the fact that different forms of technologies are very much influencing the ways in which these happen in public spaces at the moment. So we do have three parts of policing work. We have the police role, what police have to do because it's generic, prescribed, expected. So things like law enforcement, crime prevention, reassurance, peacekeeping, order maintenance, protection, etc., 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 etc. There's a lot of it. Then we have police duties, which is what police must do because it is requested by the hierarchy, the specific job that they do, the current job that they are working in relation to a certain person. And this includes things like investigative interviewing, written statements, schedules, rosters, door knocks, paperwork, data entry, writing reports, etc., etc. Again, these are all just different things that they do, sort of more administrative things, I suppose, that are related to the types of roles that they do in their everyday jobs. And of course, we've got powers. What tools the law provides or allows them to use, and the different ways in which that allows them to do that. So using their discretion, arresting people, RBTs, move-alongs, and so on. So the role that they have, you can often find the different parts of their role in different forms of legislation based on state and territories, obviously. In Tasmania, it's the Police Service Act 2003. It's a fairly normal police brief, really, that we see across a whole range of different policing organisations. Public expectations will, of course, shape that role. But, of course, there's a whole range of new modern public expectations around how police connect with communities and create relationships with those communities, as well as issues such as national security and terrorism, which were very new ideas. Cybercrime is another one, which is a very new idea. The different duties that police have are shaped by things like the things that we've talked about already: door knocks, written statements, interviewing, and so forth. But this is shaped by internal policies, the law enforcement that's happening at that particular time, and of course that can sometimes be transnational, depending on where they are and what they're doing. The necessities of the job and whether or not this is outcome driven, KPIs within the organisation and so forth. The training that police undertake, and this of course is sometimes specialised according to the groups and units that they're working within, their job descriptions and their position in the hierarchy and whether or not they need to report to anyone. Their powers are a little bit more complicated. And this is something that I'm going to talk about in a lot more detail over coming weeks because it is something that very much influences the ways in which police roles happen. So the police powers: questioning, prosecution of summary offences, controlled operations, discretion, RBT, move-alongs, etc., things that we've listed off before. Overall, the important points to say about powers are probably a little bit more extensive than others, simply because it's such a contentious area and it is open to a lot of debate. So, police require grants of formal and specific powers so that they can commit actions that would otherwise be unlawful. So, detaining a person would be unlawful, but police can arrest, for instance. Due process versus crime control is something that really influences the way that police powers happen, and most importantly, the way that the public see that police powers are happening and whether or not they think those types of things are fair or unfair. Powers usually work down the hierarchy, so depending on what the hierarchy is and who they have to report to will depend on how police powers are enforced. They've definitely evolved through time, and they still evolve every day, I would argue. The ways in which police powers are interpreted are very much influenced by a whole range of different things which happen in the community with police. They are definitely more monitored, as is police abuse of powers, but that can change depending on the context that you're in. They allow some level of leeway, but not a huge amount. It involves the use of force, and oftentimes this force, when the community is looking at it, it looks quite heavy-handed and brutal, but particularly if a member of the public has only seen the the part of that interaction that is a demonstration of their force. They haven't seen the 20 minutes or half an hour that they may have been working and negotiating with that person to try and calm the circumstance down, for instance. It's very much influenced by discretion, the fact that their power is limited in law, but this is not usually limited in action, can have a big influence on the ways in which police deliver their discretion overall. It can be very different in jurisdictions depending on where you are. So, for instance, in the Queensland, under the PPRA, the use of force is likely to cause grievous bodily harm or death if a person is involved in the commission of an offence carrying a life sentence. So if the police know that this person is going to commit an offence where the offence actually carries a life sentence, they are allowed to use force which causes grievous bodily harm. However, if we have a look at New South Wales under the Law Enforcement Power and Responsibilities Act and Regulation, they have a broader power to use such force, but only that which is reasonably necessary to enforce the law. They don't have such a wider range of force as they do in Queensland. And of course, police powers are subject to a lot of change. And I've put a little video there for you to watch around that, if you'd like to go and do that now. So we have a whole range of different models of police powers that I thought I'd just very briefly touch on. Number one, the crime control model. This is probably more what we'd consider, the punishment model way of doing things in the criminal justice system. They often talk about the punishment and the welfare models. This is very much driven by the punishment model. It prioritises the conviction of the guilty, risking conviction of some innocent people and infringements of liberties of some citizens so that they can achieve that conviction of guilty people. Then we have the due process model, which prioritises civil liberties in order to secure maximum acquittal of the innocent, risking the acquittal of many guilty people in that process, simply because it's more important to protect the innocent people. So you can see that's quite up the other end of that due control model. So you could think about due process and crime control being on a continuum where they are sort of opposite ends of the continuum a lot of the time. Then we have the freedom model, which is what Sanders and Young talk about, where it's focused on convicting the guilty, protecting innocent people from wrongful conviction, protecting the human rights of people by guarding against arbitrary or oppressive treatment, and there are thousands and thousands of examples that happen every day in that respect in policing. It's very much about protecting victims, maintaining order and civility, securing public confidence in and cooperation with policing and prosecution. So actually having the community's input into those processes and letting them have genuine buy-in so that the community continue to help police in those processes. And most importantly, achieving this without disproportionate costs or harm to other public services. And this can be a real balancing act, but we'll talk about that more as we move through the rest of semester. There's a whole range of different factors influencing police discretion, and I think we will be talking about this in further detail down the track. There's the learned attitudes, the personal factors which relate to the police officer, the learned personal attitudes and beliefs, and that can involve stereotyping about particular people, the entrenched assumptions and prejudices that person might have. The negative views or perspectives of others may influence the ways in which they do their policing work. So it may not even be other police officers, it may be other people just around them telling them what horrible people Muslim people might be, and that they're working through those assumptions and perspectives of others as they're doing their work. And notions of what we call generalisation, which is where, for instance, a police officer might have a really bad experience with a person who is of Indian descent, and I apologise for using the word Indian and generalising in that respect, but I'm pretty hopeless with geography. So I'll say a person of Indian descent. For instance, they may have had a really bad run-in with a cab driver who appeared to be of Indian descent, and then that police officer generalises the behaviours of that particular taxi driver to all other Indian people that they come into contact with in their everyday work practice. And of course, that is a very, very dangerous thing to do. Professional and situational factors also influence police discretion. These are pretty straightforward, really. Targeting of particular populations at any one time, and this can be geographically located. Responses to crime waves, which often don't really exist. Crackdowns on specific crime problems, depending on what the circumstance is. Assumptions about high crime areas. Again, this is probably something that doesn't really, it can be a bit subjective, I'm just going to say that, depending on what the circumstances are. And of course, the policing of hotspots. And most importantly, did you actually know that the more experienced officers are less likely to arrest or use arrest as a means to achieving an outcome? They're more likely to use negotiation skills. Just a little fascinating fact there that you might not know. And of course, while we're talking about roles, there's a whole bunch of other roles that police can be engaged in at any one time, depending on what their jobs involve. And of course, the extended police family of police officers that do policing work, such as volunteers, as well as liaison officers and so forth, which can be civilians or they can be sworn officers, depending on the circumstance. We've got detectives, supervisors, custody officers, police educators, policy officers, which can also be police officers, and policy spokespersons, depending on what the circumstances are. That ends this little mini lecture. I hope that was useful for you. And just let me know if you've got any questions. Letters!